Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's virtual forum hosted by the Institute of Politics and Public Service at the McCourt School of Public Policy, known to Hoyas as Geopolitics. My name is Grace Shevchenko, and I'm a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service studying international politics. At Georgetown, I currently serve as the co-chair of the Geopolitics Student Leadership Council, and I work as a He-for-She Fellow with the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, where I work to advocate for bipartisan legislation regarding the inclusion of women in conflict prevention and peace building. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce our guest, Chris Wallace, anchor of Fox News Sunday, with over 50 years of experience in the broadcasting industry. He's known for his tough questions and high-profile interviews, and has collected numerous awards for his work in journalism. Notably, he served as a debate moderator during the 2012 and 2016 presidential election cycles and received accolades for his tough interview of Vladimir Putin in 2018. Mr. Wallace, thank you so much for being here to share your perspective with us tonight. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Georgetown College Journalism Program, and the audience is encouraged to share their thoughts on social media using the hashtag GeoVirtualForum and by tagging Geopolitics at Geopolitics across all our channels. I'll now hand it over to our moderator for this evening, Geopolitics Executive Director, Noel. Thank you.
Thanks, Grace. Thanks for that great introduction and for your continued leadership at Geopolitics and across campus. I also want to thank the Georgetown College Journalism Program for co-sponsoring this event with us. And I also want to thank all of you that are tuning in, the Georgetown students, faculty, staff that are tuning in via Zoom, and all of our external audience on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. We are recording the event, and it will be posted on all of our channels for viewing later as well. I'm really excited about this conversation tonight. There's lots of different angles, and we've been exploring a lot of different angles of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it's impacting public service and politics and policy. But one area that really I'm really excited to dive into is how journalism is dealing with this issue, how journalists are dealing with trying to cover a story that really is unprecedented. Here's how the conversation is going to go. Over the first half of the conversation, our guest and I are just going to have a conversation between the two of us. About halfway through, we're going to start taking your questions. For those of you that are members of the Georgetown community, you will see at the bottom of your Zoom screen a Q&A button. Click on that, start typing in your questions. You can start typing them in now. At about halfway through, we'll start taking them. Someone from our team will let you know when your question's been selected. And then we'll bring you onto the screen to ask your question. So make sure you are TV ready. And then you'll get a chance to ask Chris your question directly. Make sure that you tell us whether you're student, staff, or faculty. And make sure to keep an eye on the chat at the bottom, because that's where we'll let you know that we're coming to you next. For those of you that know me, you'll know that my side gig is as a Fox News contributor. So I've known Chris for a few years now, and I'm a semi-regular guest on his program. It is very intimidating preparing to be interviewed by one of the best interviewers in the business. It is even more intimidating to try to prepare to interview one of the best interviewers in the business. And so, Chris, try to go easy on me, but thank you so much for joining us here tonight for this conversation.
I am delighted to be here. I hope I am TV ready myself.
You look great.
And thank you. And you are a panelist, a regular panelist on Fox News Sunday, and I was checking, you're a panelist this Sunday, so how you're treated on Sunday is directly related to how I am treated tonight. But go ahead.
I was really hoping you wouldn't notice that until after this session.
Oh no, I noticed.
Of course you did. At the Institute, we believe in exploring, we're not just an Institute of Politics, we're the Institute of Politics and Public Service, and we try to examine lots of forms of public service. We believe very, very strongly that journalism is one of the most important forms of public service in our society. And I think this current crisis that we're going through is the perfect evidence of that, where so many people are touched and impacted. Everybody is impacted by what's happening right now, and they're trying to get information, and they're turning to you. They're turning to your colleagues to figure out what is happening. You've been in the business a long time, and you've covered it all. You've covered politics and moderated presidential debates and covered international conflicts. Have you ever covered anything like this?
No, and I don't know that anybody in our country, unless you're very old and were around for the 1917 pandemic, has lived through anything like this. I mean, most of us are lucky we didn't live through World War II. When I look at sort of seminal events that I covered in my life, certainly the most frightening was 9/11. And, the sense at that time that things were out of control, and we didn't know. Obviously, there was the first day, the attack, and 3,000 of our fellow Americans were killed. And then there were the anthrax envelopes, and there was concern about were there going to be more hijackings, were there going to be chemical or biological weapons used against us. Fortunately, and also I think because of a lot of good work by a lot of people in the government, there weren't more terror attacks, or certainly nothing on that scale. But we've never had a pandemic like this that hit the United States so directly. There obviously have been other pandemics that hit other parts of the world. So, forget about being a reporter or being in public policy. Just as an American, I've never lived through anything like this. I have a second home in Annapolis. That's where my wife and I are now. But we haven't really left the property except maybe to drive in a car, but not really even to get out for a month. My wife's birthday took place during this period. We did a Zoom call with our family. Easter took place during this period. We did a Zoom call with our family. But this is, how many times you have to wash your hands walking just down this country road where we live to have a mask ready. We get some person that works for us brings us groceries, but my wife and I are sitting there disinfecting it. No, I've never lived through anything like this before, let alone had to report on something like this before.
So, it seems to me that I'm not a journalist, but it seems to me that one of the challenges of trying to cover a story like this is how little we know about what we don't know even. And it's not just the public, and it's not just you as a journalist, but even the experts that you would normally go to are still trying to figure it out in real time as we go. And so, at sort of the 40,000 foot level, how do you cover something like that where nobody has the number of answers that we want versus the number of answers that are available? How do you try to cover that?
Well, I think you have to rely on people that know as much as can be known. I agree with you. To a certain degree, a lot of students here won't remember this, but back right after 9/11, Don Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense, and he used to talk about known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. So things that we knew we didn't know, and things we didn't know we didn't know. There's a lot we know we don't know here, and so I think you want to go to experts. We've been trying as often as we could to get Anthony Fauci, the head of infectious disease. I was reporting on him when he was involved with the AIDS epidemic in the mid-'80s. He was the one who basically convinced Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time, to really come out and talk about AIDS as an epidemic and not something that just affected a small community. So he's been a real resource. Another person that I just was very impressed, I'd never met him, I'd never talked to him, but I was very impressed by his coverage, was Tom Ingoldsby, who's the head of the Center for Health Security at Johns Hopkins. And they have a lot of data, and he's been, I think, one of the leading voices. And in terms of what we know and what we don't know, but sometimes what you don't know, if you know that you don't know it, is very helpful. So it's interesting how the story has evolved as a reporter, because in the beginning, I had no patience for spin. I had no patience for any politics in this. I just wanted the facts. It was like the cop on the beat. What are the facts? And so I was as interested as possible in trying to get things from Dr. Fauci or Dr. Ingoldsby or anyone else that we could reach out to. We did a big interview one of the first weeks with Bill Gates, who's not a doctor, but has been very involved in public health for about 20 years now, has devoted billions of dollars to public health, and has made himself into an expert on this subject. So we did an interview with him the first week that I was here, sheltering in place. I think that was the 29th. And that was very useful. I thought he was really excellent in providing information. Interestingly enough, I think the story, and frankly, to my dismay, has become more political as time has gone on. And I think you probably would agree with that. And, you know, it's become kind of tribal. You now see people, you see people saying, no, we've got to stay sheltered and it's way too soon to open up. You see other people and even protests, the Liberate movement, saying, no, we've got to open up. You saw a couple of thousand people on the steps of the state capitol in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania yesterday. And a lot of that has tracked with our political divisions. You're seeing sort of liberal, big city, close together people taking one point of view on this, and more conservative people in less populated areas taking a different view. And, you know, unfortunately, but, you know, as a reporter, you cover the story. You cover the story that's there. You don't cover the story you'd like to be there. With the protests, I thought this week we had to switch and cover more of that because that had become a bigger part of the story. And so we had Mike Pence, the vice president, and Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, on the show. And, you know, listening to the two of them, it was like they were describing two different worlds in terms of the threat from the virus, the preparedness of the federal government and state governments in handling it. So that's become part of the story now. And as I still want to try to the degree possible to come back to reality and facts and where we really are on that famous curve. But, you know, the way people are responding to it is part of the story now, too.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because there's so many dimensions to the story. There's the public health dimension. There's the human dimension. There's the stuff that's happening, in the hospitals. And then there's the response, both state and local and federal. But it seems to me that so much of the attention right now is going on to that last part, on sort of what is the governmental response, that, you know, I think a lot of reporters are still trying to make sure we don't lose sight of the human element and what's happening in the communities. But it is getting sort of all consumed by the story over the federal response and the increasing politics around it.
Well, there's one thing I think you missed. I agree with everything you said, but there's one other aspect which is a really important part of the story, and that's the economic impact.
Yeah.
When you get 22 million Americans filing for unemployment benefits in a single month, when you see we're going to have a double-digit unemployment rate for the month of March and worse in April. We're going to have in the second quarter, which is April through June, we could have a GDP contraction. You know, usually it goes up 1% or 2 or 3%. It could go down 25 or 30%. And so, you know, I don't think that's an important part of the story too, because frankly, and this gets into this whole political question, it becomes kind of a class question to some degree, because, you know, I can sit here and pontificate in my shelter-in-place country home in Annapolis, where I broadcast here. I'm on Zoom, and when I do my show, I'm doing it from a virtual studio here. But there are a lot of people who, either can't do that, who have to go out into the real world and take the subway and all the fears about that, or two, have lost their jobs. So, I think on the one hand, public health is tremendously important. I think obviously it's the most important thing, because if we don't get that right, we're never going to get the economy right. But I don't dismiss it by any stretch of the imagination, the really legitimate economic concerns. And, there are a lot of people, if this goes on too long, they're going to lose businesses. They're going to lose their livelihood. They're not going to be able to pay for their home or their apartment. So that's a huge part of the story, too.
How do you, as a journalist, try to balance all of these different elements to this story, right? I mean, because you're right, there is this tension between the economic part of the story and the public health part of the story. And that tension is driving a lot of the political story. It's driving a lot of the public policy part of the story. And it seems to me that too often, at least, in some parts of cable news ecosystems, that it's being presented as a tension. How do you, as a journalist, try to provide the whole story in a way that connects them?
Well, you can't provide the whole story. I do a lot of commentary on the network, but I do an hour in a week, and I'm not going to cover everything in a week. But the story has evolved over time, and sometimes different weeks. And it was mentioned that I've been doing this for half a century. I have 51 years, starting in this summer. You have an innate sense of what the story is. So in the first early weeks, it was all public health. That was the only thing that mattered. As time went on, I thought the economic side of it became more important, because as the shelter and the just complete shutdown of the economy deepened and broadened, you can just feel it in your bones that that's a story. This past week, I thought it became more political, and we sort of led with the protests. And again, it's not whether I think that's a good thing or a bad thing, a responsible thing or irresponsible. It just is. And you just have an innate sense, at least I have an innate sense, of what I think the story is and what is the most important thing to be talking about. And, that doesn't always mean it's the most important thing in the whole story. I think clearly public health remains that. But as time goes on, there is only so much you can say about where we are in the curve or where we are in the testing. And there are other parts of the stories that come to the fore. So, it's kind of a rolling thing. You don't have to cover all of the story in each hour. You hope that over the course of weeks, you're covering various shades of the story.
I want to take a step back from this particular story and talk a little bit more about, and then I'll bring it back, but talk a little bit more about covering politics today and covering this administration. And I've heard you speak a couple of times now, most recently back in December at sort of the farewell to the museum here in Washington, talking about journalism today in this day and age. And you make 2 points. I'm going to separate each one out, and I'd like you to sort of respond to both. The first, you've said President Trump is engaged in the most direct, sustained assault on the free press in our history. And I think his purpose is clear: a concerted campaign to raise doubts over whether we can be trusted when we report critically about his administration. We've seen, even before President Trump, that trust in the media has been eroding. That seems to be kind of, to me at least, dangerous, particularly in a moment like this. Do you think his continued attacks on your profession makes it harder when the information you're giving people can legitimately mean life or death or prosperity or not?
Well, I suppose, as distrust increases, mistrust increases, it doesn't make your job harder to do. It probably makes it harder for you to break through to some people. Incidentally, I hate it when I'm quoted to myself. It's like,
sorry about that.
But it's true. It's funny, when I said that, it was the closing of the museum, and I said that, and I stand by it, I think the president is engaged in the most direct assault on our on our free press and our history, I got some emails back from some people who said, well, wait a minute, what about John Adams and the Sedition Act of, I don't know, 1798, 1800, whatever. And I said, okay, I wasn't around for that. I've been around a lot. I wasn't there. I stand corrected about John Adams. But, I guess I was really talking about in my lifetime, which is considerable. And I do think so. And I think, as I suggested, that I think it's somewhat cynical, because I think the president feels if I can discredit the press, then or at least discredit them with my supporters, then when they criticize me or when they report critically or negatively about things I did, then it loses some of its credibility with those supporters and perhaps with some other people. So I think it's a calculated effort on his part. The fact that he's attacked me in tweets the last 2 Sundays hasn't gone unnoticed, although, as I said to somebody, a couple of people wrote to me and they said, I could tell they were kind of reaching out to buck me up. And I said, the third or fourth time he does it, it loses its sting. And this is about the third or fourth time he's attacked me. And I was thinking, what was it he was attacking me for? A week ago Sunday, he was attacking me because the New York Times had done a very thorough and I thought interesting piece about all the information that the president got much earlier than he had indicated, that he was getting intelligence from the intelligence community in January and information from a number of public health people in late January, early February, and that this had gone, if not unheard or unnoticed, it had gone unacted on, and it wasn't until mid-March that he declared the emergency. Well, I was asking some people about it, and apparently the fact that I even asked about it was offensive. And then this last week, it was even more clear because he attacked Nancy Pelosi, and then he said that I and Fox were on the wrong path. And I thought, so what he's basically saying is the fact that I had a voice of the opposition on the show. Our first guest was the vice president. Our second guest was Nancy Pelosi. And the very fact that I was talking to a critic was a mistake, which to me says all you have to say.
The next point you make in the same speech, right, almost immediately, the very next paragraph, you say, even if Trump is trying to undermine the press for his own calculated reasons, when he talks about bias in the media, unfairness, I think he has a point. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that the president's aggressive attack on the press, first of all, I think that in a lot of the media, that there is a liberal slant. So when the president talks about a liberal slant, I think that he's right, just as I think in a lot of Fox News, there is I don't think in the news side, but a lot of Fox opinion, I think has a conservative slant. And so I think that to some degree, it's like, as I think I've said, even hypochondriacs sometimes get sick. Even the president who attacks the press sometimes has a legitimate reason. I do think that there is a somewhat slanted press. But the other point, the more important point I was making, was that I thought that some in the media had used the president's attack as an excuse to attack back, to really break down some of the levels of objectivity and become adversaries to the president. And boy, look, there are a lot of things the president does in these White House briefings I'm not particularly comfortable with that he does, but there is a lot of arguing with the president, not asking questions, but arguing with the president in these briefings. And of course, now you get to see how the sausage is made because these briefings are on live for long periods of time, where I really think sometimes it isn't reporting or even, testing, which is certainly something I try to do as a reporter. I think that it's advocacy or arguing. And I sometimes think that goes over the line. Let me just make one more point if I can. I think it's a mistake because to the degree that we're seen as players on the field, I think we undercut our own credibility. If people watch us doing our job and they don't think, mean, I'm a tough interviewer, and I like to think if you watch my interview with Pence on Sunday and my interview with Pelosi, I was tough on both of them. But I think sometimes some reporters become so bent on beating the president, on winning the argument, that I think they undercut their own credibility. And to the degree that they end up playing his game, he's a combatant, they're a combatant, I think they're undercutting their own credibility.
Is it a hard line to see, though, sometimes? I mean, again, using this current crisis as an example, if the information that's coming from the podium is not right or questionable or different than it was the day before or even moments before sometimes, where is that line for a good, thorough, aggressive journalist to push back, to correct, to try to get the truth, get the facts, versus falling into more advocacy?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't know that I can give you a precise answer. I certainly don't have any problem with people fact-checking, or, if the president says, we got enough tests for everybody, and you want to come back and say, well, Governor Cuomo says they don't have the tests, or in a variety of places, people have gone for weeks without having enough access to tests. I don't have any problem with that at all. There was a famous obscenity case, I think it was in the 60s, and Justice Potter Stewart of the Supreme Court said, I can't define obscenity, but I know it when I see it. And that's kind of how I feel. I'm not sure I could say it's precisely this line, but there's a difference between challenging and arguing. There's a difference between an adversary, in a sense of being an adversary establishment. The press is an adversary of the establishment, and being an advocate. And I'm not sure I can precisely define it, but I think I generally know it when I see it, and I think a lot of other people do too.
We're going to move to student questions in a few moments, so I just encourage those students who are watching to, again, look at the bottom of your screen and click on the Q&A button to start submitting your questions if you haven't done so already. Chris, there were two interesting polls that came out today that showed that people's attitudes towards various elements of the coronavirus story are informed in large part by where they get their news. And that goes from everything from the federal response to how fast we should reopen the economy to, even how serious the problem even is. And it's interesting because you'll have viewers of CNN, MSNBC kind of on one end of the spectrum, viewers of Fox on another end of the spectrum, viewers who get their news from the three broadcast networks somewhere in between. And I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on that and that dynamic, why that may be, and have the lines between news and opinion just become too blurry?
I've had time to do a lot of things I wouldn't normally do during this month lockdown. And one of them is I've read a lot of books. And in fact, I've kind of run out of books. My wife, Lorraine, is getting them from Amazon, and I'm reading books I never would have. But one book that I had that I brought out, and I don't know if I would have gotten to it otherwise, is a book called Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein. And he has a very interesting thesis. And he basically says, it isn't Republican or Democrat. It isn't Fox News or MSNBC. It isn't liberal or conservative. It isn't urban coasts versus rural Midland. It's all of those. That there is basically that we have broken down into tribes, and that our view of our politics, our view of our media, our view of entertainment, our view of our beliefs, religious or non-religious beliefs, it's all tied, it's all part of this tribal identity, and it all becomes a kind of self-reinforcing mechanism, phenomenon. And so, you believe a certain thing, you live in a certain place, you have certain views about church or religion or faith or social issues. You watch a certain read or watch certain news sources that reinforce those beliefs, and it's no surprise that people in the different tribes see things differently. And so exactly as I say, it is not a surprise. I think it's disheartening. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the great Harvard social scientist and later, of course, a U.S. Senator from New York, used to say, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And I think increasingly in this country, and it's been going on for a while, this didn't start with the COVID-19, people have their own set of facts, and it even comes with a virus. And so some people think it's a huge threat and it's way too soon to sort of reopen the country. And there's some people who think the threat's been overblown, and the models were talking about 2 million people, and now it's not 60. It's 60,000, and it's been too much about about too little. It's just the country that we're in now, and again, that's one reason why, to the degree possible, I think in something like this, which is literally a matter of life and death, you have to deal with the facts. And I have to say, if I'm going to listen to somebody, I don't want to listen to a politician, and I don't want to listen to a reporter. I want to listen to a public health expert because they really know.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of these biases and tribes, they don't break down ideologically, right? I mean, there's, for example, a huge bias, I think, in the press coverage let me reframe that. There's a lot of coverage of what's happening in the big cities and a lot less of what's happening maybe in some of the other parts of the country. Now, you can argue that makes sense because the cities are the biggest hotspots right now, but coverage tends to focus on the coastal cities a little bit more than it does on some of the other heartland cities. And I would think that would impact how people outside of the coastal cities view things. I also think it's interesting, right? Story selection has a lot to do with this. Some news outlets are focusing a lot on the protests that are happening, and those are newsworthy. But as compared to the percentage of the country that actually supports what's happening in those protests, sometimes I think it gives off a little bit of a skewed sense of where the country really is.
No, I agree with that. I think that, first of all, the news operations are in the big cities. I mean, where are most of the news coverage we see? It's coming out of New York. It's coming out of Los Angeles. That's where people are. And among other things, I know here at Fox, we've got real restrictions on being able to travel. So can we cover the cities where we already have people? Yes. Can we go out to places that, for instance, out to South Dakota where that Smithfield Farms meat plant is? I think it's hard for us and a lot of the other news organizations to get there. So you end up taking feeds of things, but you're not naturally there, and you're not covering it in depth. But all of this, as I say, tends to create two different realities, and that's sad, but I suppose unavoidable in this day and age in the world we live in.
Yeah. So one last question for me before we go to our first student question, and it's related to this. And that is, look, you got your start in local journalism, and so much of what's happening is happening on the ground in these local communities. But this is an industry that was struggling even before coronavirus, and it's now being even further decimated. Newsrooms across the country, local newsrooms, being slashed in dramatic fashion. These local reporters are the ones who are giving people the information that's really relevant to their day-to-day lives. How do we fix that problem? How big of a problem is it?
No, it's a huge problem, and it was a big problem before we had the COVID virus here in Maryland. The Capital Gazette, the paper which suffered a terrible attack when a gunman came in and killed, I think, 5 people. There were questions whether it could stay in business, not because of safety, but because of the finances. And it's true increasingly around the country. And long before the virus, this was a problem because, one thing I think you and I would completely agree on, better stuff doesn't happen when people don't know about it. Worse things happen when people don't know about it. I guess it was it was either Brandeis or Frankfurter, I've forgotten, my second Supreme Court justice I'm going to quote today, who said that, I think it was Brandeis, that sunshine is the great disinfectant. And, to the degree that we have less local coverage and less eyes watching what people are doing, how they're spending our money, the laws they're making that affect us, the more bad things can happen. And you're exactly right. Right now, yes, I'm interested in what's happening in New York, and I'm interested in what's happening in Smithfield, but I'm really interested in what's happening in Annapolis. And in fact, they just came out, the Maryland Department of Public Health, with how many cases and deaths there were in each zip code in Maryland. And you can be sure my wife and I went on Google and, typed in our zip code and to see how many cases there were here. So, I don't have to tell you, it was Tip O'Neill who said all politics is local. I'm not sure all politics is local, but certainly the politics that affects you most directly is local.
Yeah. All right, we're going to go to student questions now, which I guarantee will be far better than any of mine. And our first question will come from Paulina Enck. Paulina, tell us who you are, school, year, what you're studying, and where you're zooming in from.
Hello, thank you for having me on. My name is Paulina Enck. I'm a junior in the School of Foreign Service. I'm zooming in from Sparta, New Jersey, and I'm also a reporter at The Federalist. My question involves, there's been a lot of bad facts lately, and a lot of reporters and politicians and experts even have said completely contradictory things regularly. How can responsible reporters, report on facts? How can they know what to trust? And how can they avoid embarrassing themselves just days later?
Well, it's a good question, Paulina. In the end, you're only as good as your sources. I don't think you ever get in trouble if you quote a person. I don't feel my credibility is on the line if I quote the president or Pelosi or Mike Pence or whatever. They're saying what they're saying. In terms of facts, I don't think anybody thinks or expects that I'm a public health expert and I know how the curve is going to go. So, I think you have to source it. You have to, hopefully you have good sources and reliable sources. But to some degree, as we discussed, Mo and I at the very beginning of this, so much information has changed and so much of this is unknown to begin with. So, look at the most expert people. You have this think tank at the University of Washington, I think it's IMHE, and their initial model was it was going to be 2 million to 1 million people who were killed if nothing happened. And then it went down to 100 to 200,000, and then it was 68,000, and now it's 60,000. Well, nobody knows. And in the end, the key is you got to quote them and say, this is what this, first of all, you want to quote responsible organizations, not irresponsible organizations. But in the end, even the most responsible ones can get something wrong. And as long as you're quoting them and doing your honest best, not to go with something that, feeds your narrative, but what you think is good, solid information that you have reason to trust, I think you're okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Paulina. Our next question comes from Jason Welch.
Hi, Chris. How are you doing today?
Good.
So I know, especially right now, people are desperately looking for trusted source of information. But even prior to the COVID outbreak, according to a 2018 AIC poll and the 2020 Edelman Trust Barometer, right, news media institutions as a whole continue to rank extremely low in the U.S. public opinion for their credibility. So what do you think, as an industry, journalists and news organizations should be doing to earn back America's trust, and can they even really do so?
Well, one thing I think they can do, it's a good question. One of the things that I think they can do is what I was talking about before, not get into the fight, not become advocates, and to the degree possible, try to be objective and try to be even-handed. It's funny, this is all, it's like pre-COVID, post-COVID. But pre-COVID, when I was out and around, a lot of people would come up to me and compliment me and say how fair I was, how even-handed I was. And on the one hand, I like being complimented as much as the next person, but on the other hand, I found it really depressing. And the reason I did is because when I started in the news business back in 1969 as a reporter at the Boston Globe, fairness, accuracy was the bare minimum requirement. If you weren't fair or accurate, you got fired. You were praised for your reporting or your writing, or in TV for your broadcasting. You weren't praised for fairness. That was, like it went with the territory. And the fact today that people can stand out and that I get praised for being fair, to me, is a real sad commentary. Part of it, I think, and look, Fox is part of it, MSNBC is part of it. I think the broadcast networks are part of it. I think the New York Times is part of it, is that people perceive that they have an angle, that they have a partisan position. And to the degree that happens, then they get caught up in this whole tribal identity that I was talking about. So if you're a New York urban liberal, well, you like the New York Times. And if you're a country club Republican upper middle class person, maybe you like the Wall Street Journal, and and on with the broadcast networks and the cable networks. And I like to think that that people can distinguish between the opinion at Fox and the news side of Fox. And I could describe it to you, but I'm sure there are a lot of folks out there who can't define it. And look, I'd say the same thing about MSNBC and CNN and a lot of newspapers as well. But I do think that there's opinion in newspapers, there's an op-ed page, there's an editorial page, there's opinion in magazines, there's opinion on television. I don't say that they're bad things, but I do think that probably has hurt the credibility of organizations, because let's say you're a conservative and you think that MSNBC is liberal, well, then you don't think MSNBC is credible. So that hurts the credibility. So to the degree that people think that news organizations have a stake in the game, I think it hurts their general level of credibility, at least with some of the population.
Thanks, Jason. It's interesting, Chris. It's not uncommon that after I appear on your show or on any of the other news shows at Fox, that I will get some angry tweets from people who say, I can't believe Fox has you on as a Democrat. Why don't you go to MSNBC or CNN where you belong? And I always find that, and I get that semi-regularly, I always find that where you belong to be really interesting, because, it gets to your point, certain people select certain news outlets because they're looking for a particular perspective, I think. And if they hear a different perspective, it offends them in some ways, which I just think is interesting in the context of what you were just talking about.
Let me just quickly ask you, though, do you also get pushback, not from conservatives, now that you're on their network? You also get pushback from liberals who say, why are you on Fox?
Oh, yeah. No, I once even got a hate tweet from Rosie O'Donnell, who suggested that I should get off Fox if I cared about such and such issue. And so, I do get that from my former colleagues in Democratic politics sometimes. So
you and Donald Trump have something in common. You both get hate tweets from Rosie O'Donnell.
He's probably gotten a few more than I have.
Yes, I think so.
But look, when I was at the DNC, I went my entire tenure there without ever once engaging with the network. And I think that was a mistake in retrospect. It's one of the reasons why I did sign with Fox eventually, is because I thought it was important to have a different perspective on there. All
right, let's get another student.
Anyway, yes, I was falling into the trap of being interviewed by you. Okay, Stephanie, tell us who you are, your graduation year, major, where you're Zooming from.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Stephanie. I am Zooming in from Toronto in Canada. I'm a graduate student in the Masters of International Business and Policy program, and I should be graduating in this December. So you've talked about this a lot, so you can keep your answer quite brief. But you mentioned the book by Ezra Klein, and that the polarization is really partially due to the fact that we have a desire to consume self-reinforcing media and self-reinforcing information. Do you think the media and news outlets are partially to blame for this? You have talked a lot about the difference between news and opinion, but in general, there is clearly a left-leaning and right-leaning outlets when you look at it as a whole and all the information that's being put out there. Should they be less biased?
I actually hold you, not you, Stephanie, but you, the news consumer, responsible. When people ask me how to sort of sort your way through the world we live in now, I say, watch or listen or read every day some news source that you disagree with. That if you like Fox News, read the New York Times. You can watch Fox News, I'm not saying not to, but also read the New York Times. If you like MSNBC, read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. I think one of the worst things that people do is that they just read stuff, exactly as you say, that reinforces what they already believe. Challenge yourself. Go read what the other side says. I mean, as a good newsman, I do that all the time. I watch Special Report, but I also watch, which is our 6 o'clock newscast, but I also watch one of the evening broadcast networks every night. I read the New York Times, but I also read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. And, my feeling is it's like triangulation. If you're seeing what one side, and yes, I may agree with that side more, but then you also see the other side. You may not agree with that other side, but at least you're aware of it. And at least if you're really open-eyed and open-minded about it, you're able to, one, learn something, and two, challenge your preconceptions on these subjects.
All right, Stephanie, thanks for the question. John, tell us who you are and where you're calling in from.
Hi, great to be here. My name is John Scare. I'm SFS class of 23. I'm calling in from Long Island, New York, and I'm a big fan. And my question would be, do you believe that the Trump administration, including officials and the president himself, do you believe that it is effectively and accurately communicating with the general public and the media concerning its response and its success with its policies concerning COVID-19?
No. I don't mean that it's openly lying, but I think that they're trying to tell a story of how well they're doing. And I think that there are some areas in which they are doing well. And I think there's some areas in which they started way too slowly and have gotten better. But having said that, I don't know that I would separate this administration from others. I mean, generally speaking, and I think Mo would agree with this, and you could say maybe this White House has been worse than others, but White Houses and press secretaries work to sell them, and particularly one that's 6 months away from a re-election campaign. They're going to put the best face on what they've done. They're going to minimize the mistakes they've made. And I think that there's certain information. And look, when I am watching those briefings, who do I listen to? It goes back to what I was talking about before. I really pay attention when the non-political people come on, when Deborah Birx comes on, especially when Tony Fauci comes on, because I think they're absolutely giving it to you straight. Some of the people in public health, I think, are giving it to you straight. Some of the more political people, including the president, I think are pushing a line. Some of it is true. I mean, one of the things that the president, he's been criticized, I think fairly, for not responding quickly enough in February and March to the situation as it increased. And whenever he's challenged on that, he immediately goes back always to the travel ban with China at the end of January. Well, that turns out to have been a good, smart thing to do, and it wasn't universally received at the time. But it doesn't excuse, and he really doesn't deal with what he failed to do in February and March. So, I think you need to understand when you're watching a White House briefing, it's people that work for that president, not necessarily the public health people, but certainly a lot of the other people, and they're going to defend and put the best face on what he has done. But again, I want to emphasize that's been done with presidents and White Houses and press secretaries time immemorial.
All right, thanks, John. Next, we've got Ben. Ben, where are you calling in from and school and year?
Great, thank you. Yes, I'm calling in from Alexandria, Virginia. I'm an MBA student graduating in 2021. My question is, we spoke a lot about the media side, but how do you kind of ensure that the organizations and experts that you're actually bringing on for interviews or talking with, are being truthful themselves? Everyone seemed to have political motivation, so how do you kind of keep them honest as well when you bring them on for interviews?
Well, I disagree, Ben, that everyone has political motivations. I think there certainly are some. And, there's been some legitimate questions raised about the WHO. And, in fairness, I've learned a lot. One of the great things about my job is it's kind of a forced education. And so particularly preparing for a Sunday show where you're going to have the vice president on or the speaker of the House or the Treasury secretary, is you kind of got to get yourself up to speed. So in the course of the last few weeks, since the president has attacked it, I've learned a lot more about what the WHO is. It's one of those things you just sort of hear about, but you don't really know. Well, it's an arm of the United Nations, and the United Nations, obviously their organizations are going to be somewhat loath to take on the member countries. So, one of the arguments that's made, not as a defense, because obviously the WHO did not provide enough information early enough on about the threat of the coronavirus in China, but it may have been unrealistic to expect them to really lay the wood on one of their member countries, particularly because I'm sure there was some thought, well, gee, if we really alienate them, then they're not going to let us get into the country so we can find out what's really going on the ground there. But having said that, I do think that there are people who over time you come to think, I don't think they have a political axe to grind. And one example, and a lot of it was because I was reading what he was saying, and it wasn't that he seemed to be critical of the administration or positive to the administration. He was just straight, was this fellow Tom Ingoldsby, who's the head of the Center for Health Security. I've interviewed him 2 or 3 times now. And, I've read for weeks what he's been saying. I just don't see any political bent there. There are some people who seem to be either part of the administration or, being enlisted to support the administration. And, I not that I discredit them or disbelieve them, but I factor that into how I assess what they have to say. But there are enough open, honest, independent sources of information there. It doesn't always mean they're right, but it does mean that I don't think they have a specific partisan axe to grind.
Okay, I do not, I'm having some technical problems. Can you hear me?
Who, me?
Okay,
Chris?
I can hear, okay, I can't hear you, but you can hear me. So while I deal with that, we're going to call on Caitlin to ask the next question.
I can hear you, so don't say anything naughty. Go ahead, Caitlin.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Chin. I'm a graduate calling in from Arlington, Virginia, and I was just wondering, around the country, news outlets, and especially local news outlets, are struggling financially at a time where information is more important than ever. And I was just wondering, what are things that we or the government can do to support journalism, and will stimulus money be enough?
Well, you sort of are nervous about government paying for news organizations because you want them to be independent, you don't want them to be beholden. So the idea that the local government is going to bail out the local newspaper, that comes potentially with strings attached. And, in the end, the market speaks and the free market speaks. And I think that whether it's newspapers or local television stations or internet sources, that they have to find a business model that supports them. I mean, one of the things that I'm very impressed with, and I've become to rely on, I was not a big fan. You know, I'm older. I was not a big fan of reading the news online because I love to open my front door in the morning. I know there are a bunch of you out there who are groaning, but I like to open the front door, get the newspaper, put it, you know, and at the kitchen table as I'm having breakfast and read it. Well, now I don't want to get a newspaper because I'm worried I'm going to have to disinfect it and who's been touching it. So I've been doing a lot of my reading online, and I hated doing it because, you know, if you get something free for your whole life, you don't like paying for it. But I'm now paying for newspapers online and the paywalls. And, you know, it works great. And I love it. Everybody's probably saying to themselves, wow, this old guy suddenly realized that internet's going to catch on. But, you know, the point is that you know, the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal found a model that worked. And in the end, I'm not really comfortable with government bailouts or handouts to news organizations. I think they have to find a model that works that to allow them to stay in business. And if they don't, somebody else will find one that does. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. And my tech problems have been solved. All I know is a moment ago, Chris, I saw you wagging your finger at me, but I couldn't hear what you were saying.
That's good.
I prefer it that way. So, all right, let's go to Tyler for the next question.
Hi there. I'm a graduate student in the School of Foreign Service in the MSFS program. I'm particularly interested, just like you, I like to receive a physical copy of the newspaper in the morning. But where do you get your news from? What are your preferred sources? And how do you kind of comb through them to understand that they are valid, worth reading, stories worth kind of putting away in your mind? And how do you suggest that we do the same?
Well, and again, part of this probably is an age bias, but I like news organizations and that I know have an editorial process. You know, I know some internet sources, you know, you don't really know what their backing is. There's some that you do, but there are some that you don't, and you wonder, you know, is the person who's reporting this, did they have to submit it to an editor? Did it get fact checked? Is it, you know, is there a business model that depends on accuracy? So, you know, I look at a number of news sources that I guess one could say are established and establishment. You know, the New York Times I read every day, the Wall Street Journal I read every day. I particularly like the editorial page and the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal because I think they have really interesting, well-researched arguments. You know, they're making a case, obviously, and they tell me things I don't know, which I always find very valuable. The Washington Post, for a lot of, you know, as somebody who does a political government policy weekly Sunday talk show, they cover it in a greater depth than anybody else. There are a lot of blogs. There are various think tanks who put things out. But again, one of the things I'm always trying to do is challenge myself. So if I read something in a that has a kind of liberal slant, or it comes from an organization that may have a liberal slant, I'm always want to check out the other side of it. And when I do my show, Tyler, one of the things that I do is I'm always looking for pushback. So if I'm going to interview, say, the vice president this week, and I know he's going to make a case that, you know, how good the administration's response on testing is, I have a great researcher. I call her Chris's brain, and I'll basically say to her, give me the pushback, give me the counter argument. Not to say that that's right and that the administration is wrong, but give me alternative, you know, different facts or a different analysis so that I can kind of test that and maybe form a question that tests that, and asking the vice president or whoever it is I'm talking to that week. And let me tell you, if I'm talking to Nancy Pelosi, I do exactly the same thing. So, you know, I'm always looking for both sides of any argument.
All right, thanks, Tyler. Chris, we're coming up on the end of our time, but I wanted to close with one last question. You are besides being a top-notch journalist, a student of history. And you've looked at how different presidents make decisions. You've just written a book about presidential decision-making in an equally tumultuous period of American history. Tell us a little bit about that, and maybe, closing thoughts on sort of the parallels you see between that and what we're going through now.
Well, funny you should mention, because
whoa, look at that.
Here it is. It's called Countdown 1945. I have to look at what the subtitle is. The Extraordinary Story of the Atomic Bomb and the 116 Days That Changed the World. And it's going to be out on June 9th, so you can go to Barnes & Noble or Amazon or wherever online, and you can pre-order. It's there right now. The story, briefly, is about the 116 days between when Harry Truman becomes president, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt has died, and when the bomb is, and that's April 12th, just a week ago last Sunday, and August 6th, when the bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. And what's fascinating, it's a really interesting story. It's not just about Truman, it's about Truman and the decision-making he's going through, the scientists at Los Alamos, the flight crew that's on Tinian Island that's getting ready, highly competitive, people jockeying for who's going to be on the final flight, a 10-year-old girl named Hideko Tamura who's on the ground in Hiroshima and who incidentally is still alive, is 86 years old. This incidentally will be the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima on August 6th, is still alive, and I got to interview. It's about all the different aspects of this story. But one of the things that really impressed me was Harry Truman's decision-making. Harry Truman had been kind of a backbench senator for 10 years. He was not expected to be on the ticket. The reason he was basically picked in 1944 as Roosevelt was running for a fourth term was literally the Democratic Party said, well, who's out there who would hurt the ticket the least? Not who would help the ticket, but would hurt it the least. And they figured this kind of non-entity, Harry Truman. So he becomes vice president in January, and he had spoken to Truman privately twice. He'd been in some cabinet meetings, but he had spoken to Roosevelt privately twice in the 3 months he'd been vice president. In other words, he was basically totally unprepared to be president. And in fact, when he becomes president, he's sworn in on April 12th, and the Secretary of War, a 77-year-old guy named Henry Stimson, says, I need to talk to you privately, Mr. President. He takes him in and says, there is a program you know nothing about in which we have developed the most fearsome weapon, most terrifying weapon of all time. And that is the first time that Harry Truman had ever heard of the Manhattan Project. And between then and August 6th, 116 days, he has to find out what the system is all about. The weapon had never been tested, so he's got to first make sure it works. He goes to Potsdam in a summit with Joseph Stalin, the Russian leader, and Winston Churchill, the British leader, the three great allies who've now beaten Hitler but are now about to fight the war in Japan. And he's got to decide what to do. And the thing that impressed me so much was the lengths he went to. He had meetings, repeated meetings about, first, did the bomb work? Did it make more sense than a ground invasion? The moral implications, the political implications, the environmental implications, the short-term implications, the long-term implications. And anybody who reads this book, I think you're going to just be, yes, I know, I'm putting it up again. I think you're going to be so impressed by just the decision-making process that you would hope that every president, and I don't think it's been true. I've been covering presidents since I spent 6 years in the White House with Ronald Reagan in 1982 to 88, and I've covered every president since then to some degree. I don't think every president goes through this process, but I think you read this and you think, well, maybe I agree with what he did, maybe I don't agree with what he did, but I think that he did absolutely, he exhausted every possible argument for and against before he made his decision. I just want to finish by telling a story. So here I am, and I'm doing the show and I'm doing a bunch of other things. But one of the things it turns out you have to do, writing the book is only part of it. I am now in the process of reading the audio book, and I have to say, I think it's one of the torturous things I've ever had to do. If you ever had to read 300 pages out loud, day by day, I'm reading about 50 pages a day, and that takes about 4 hours. It's hard. I'm not a first responder. I understand my place in the world, but tomorrow I'll be spending 4 or 5 hours reading another 50 or 60 pages of this wonderful writing, this great book here. I just what I say that the audio books. Next time you get an audio book, think of the poor guy who had to sit there for about 5 days reading it. It's work.
Yeah, well, I've spent every night reading a different chapter of Harry Potter to my children, and with all the interruptions, I think you might actually have it a little bit easier. Chris, Wallace, when we talk about journalism as a form of public service, you are who I think of. Thank you so much for all that you do to keep us all informed, and thank you so much for being so generous with your time tonight. And go easy on me this Sunday.
Well, I think you pass. So I will go easy on you. I want to thank everybody for watching and listening. When Mo asked me to do this, I even though I knew I was going to be reading and my voice might be hoarse, I wanted to do it because I think anything we can do to bring community into these times when we're all so isolated, I'm all for. So thank you for doing this. It was my pleasure. And watch Fox News Sunday this week, starring Athey. And did I mention I've written a book?
Love it. And to all of you in the audience who tuned in, either here on Zoom or on any of our other platforms, thank you for spending some of your time with us this evening. Keep following at Geopolitics to find out about the remainder of our virtual forum events. Tomorrow night is part 2 of our Chats with the Chairs. We had Tom Perez from the DNC last night. We've got Ronna McDaniel tomorrow night. And then next Tuesday for a conversation on American leadership during times of crisis with Senator Mitt Romney. Thank you all again, and stay tuned for more.